reacting to some of the early news and playing time information that has come out of camp this week. That's what we're going to talk about on today's episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, I will give a quick pitch for the Stealing Signals newsletter. I just wrote up a full unpaywalled breakdown of what to expect from here till the beginning of the season. It is pinned at the top of the page at bengretch.substack.com for anyone who has thought about subscribing in the past. Go ahead and read that post, get an idea of all the content and subscription plans and everything content that's coming and the subscription plans and how it all works. But yeah, we want to talk today about the first week of camp. One of the fun things that happens right away when all these teams report, we get these first practices and we get a bunch of information about who's running with the ones, who's running with the second team, the third team, surprising sort of usage stuff. And, you know, we are often talking, Shawn, about fantasy football on the terms of basically you'd almost be forgiven for thinking that we might think that none of that matters because things can evolve in a million different ways. We think that once, between now and week 1, a lot can change. From week 1 to week 17, a lot can change. Once we get the pads on and we start playing the actual games, sometimes the cream is going to rise. Some of the later picks are going to bubble up and actually get playing time because the guys in front of them are just not good enough. It's not just about projecting who's starting week 1, which is what a lot of the conversation does happen to be about right now. And yet, having said that, there is a lot of interesting news. And so it begs the question of, how do we respond to it? I'm doing a ton of slow drafts right now. You're doing a ton of drafting as well. We are obviously seeing the news. We're obviously thinking through the news. I released my full projections the other day. And in the post where I released those, I mentioned that some of the early camp news had caused me to adjust some of my projections before I released the full thing on a couple key players. It's not like I don't think it's relevant, and I would assume very much the same for you. And yet we may argue that it's a little bit less relevant than others or react to it in different ways. So I think a fun show premise today and a fun idea for us to sit and talk about, how much we want to respond to what sounds like the early camp depth chart type stuff, the projected week 1 roles, which often we're then trying to leverage in terms of how things might progress throughout the season.
Yeah, I think it's a great topic, and it's always fun to hear what different people are seeing, what their reactions are to those things. There's so much news, Ben, and it's going to be difficult to keep track of it all. And most of it really is still just of the same puff piece variety types of thing. And yet anything that is too striking or any situation that defies your expectations in terms of where people start, I think that's something that we have to differentiate between are these situations where you're saying, I think that a player is more talented, and as the season goes along, that talent is going to show out, but you understand that there is going to be a journey that has to be made. And so if that journey didn't entirely take place on the first 2 or 3 days of training camp, that is not a surprise, right? We're not thinking that a specific second string player or third string player is going to win the starting job in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the season, much less on the first 2 or 3 days of practice. And yet there will be situations that are pretty surprising in terms of how a team starts out. And if a team's starting rotation as they work through practice reps defies what you would have expected just yourself, even with having a certain take on a player where you're like, I think this guy is going to eventually make it. Anytime that your own expectations for how the early practices run, you know, that's going to be interesting to you, right? And you're going to make some changes, or you're going to think through it differently, or you're at least ask yourself the question, does this move the needle for me when I'm trying to understand the team? because it's not just about individual players. There may be health situations that impact an entire roster in terms of the upside that the offense has. There may be day one evaluations that call into question the coaching staff. I mean, one of the things that you get a lot right now after the sort of Shanahan-esque tree did a lot of positive things in 2023 is that everybody wants to chase offensive coordinators. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I do want to mention kind of almost as a one-off unrelated to this conversation, but also as it directly does relate, so many of those things are only clear in retrospect. And some of the elements that people think that you should see, if you had played that exact same thesis in 2022, you would have gotten crushed. And it's easy to overlook those types of things. But so as we're working through what offenses we think are going to be dynamic, what coaching staffs are going to be innovative, we want to take in as much of this new information as we can. We want to ask ourselves honestly questions about it, but we also want to take it with a grain of salt. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and yet one where, you do, it kind of raises eyebrows in both directions, right? So I have my new article out about the 4 wide receivers who will throw you a rope if you have fallen off the wide receiver cliff. I don't think it'll surprise Stealing Bananas listeners that Wan'Dale Robinson is one of those guys. One of the little pieces I threw in there, not really to make the case, but just because camps are going and these things are interesting, was an interesting beat report that the very first play in camp was a pass to Robinson, and it was a play that had included a lot of pre-snap motion. The defenders were talking about how they were doing this, that, and the other thing, and it was confusing and blah, blah, blah. And the write-up on it is positive from the perspective of, okay, the Giants are going to incorporate this element that we know was so important last season. And then Brian Dable is talking about how, this is year 3, year 1, you got to work on certain things, year 2, year 3. And partly in your head, you're thinking to yourself, well, some of the teams incorporated it the week after it was demonstrated to work. So if you're telling me that you can incorporate some of these things in the 3rd season, I'm going to take that as both a positive and a negative, right? It doesn't just work one direction. So Ben, I think it's fascinating to think about these early practice reports through a number of different lenses and through a number of different, more global perspectives.
I think that's really interesting. When you were talking about the McVay, understudy, Shanahan, offensive coordinator things, I thought you were going to bring up Rondale Moore running behind Ray McCloud in Falcons camp. That was a little bit of a concern for me in terms of the coaching stuff. If you can't see that Rondale Moore needs to be running ahead of Ray McCloud on day one, I'm mildly concerned about your ability to identify talent. And
Ben, how much should we give credit for or be worried about situations where there is an incumbent or a veteran who knows the offense and they're playing early and that's not really what I wanted? It's not a surprise to me. Are we still betting on talent there? Are we taking the situation where a veteran is taking key snaps early as a situation where you already doubt the coaching staff? I mean, there are a variety of things going on.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, I think, a tricky balance. I guess my opinion would be that it's a little bit case by case. Let's start talking about some specific situations in that regard. And one coaching staff that's new, that's been much discussed, and that has multiple of these elements occurring early on is the Chargers, is Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman, his offensive coordinator. Gus Edwards has had some type of undisclosed thing that has kept him out of camp so far. They're not talking about it. It's one of the Harbaugh things is he doesn't love to talk about injury related stuff, so we don't get great information there. You might think that's really exciting for Kamani Vidal, who's a guy that we've talked a lot about this offseason out of Troy, 6th round rookie, but a guy who had a lot of volume, handled a big workload in college, was 2nd in all of college football last year and missed tackles for. Some of that type of elusiveness and positive peripheral stuff is definitely there and present in his profile. He's running behind like our old friend Jarrett Patterson, who was
Yeah, we like Jarrett Patterson.
a day 3 guy who was with Washington for a little bit. Isaiah Spiller is still kicking around over there, but J.K. Dobbins is clearly running as the one. And so throughout most of the offseason, the thought was that Vidal had an opportunity to earn big volume. And I've made a case multiple places now that the day 3 capital shouldn't have such a huge effect, because when there's a clear opportunity and there's a couple aging, running backs who've had major injuries ahead of him, that the fact that this running back is entering that type of opportunity situation has been favorable in more recent seasons, not over the longest term, but because running back ADP or running back actual NFL draft capital has been falling over time, we've seen this a little bit more. We saw Isaiah Pacheco as a day 3 pick, as a round 7 running back, immediately be the starter because the guys there weren't good enough. Clyde Edwards-Helaire wasn't good enough. We saw Tyler Algier before Bijan Robinson step into that Atlanta offense and immediately play. We saw Ramondre Stevenson step into the New England offense and immediately play. We saw Michael Carter step into the Jets offense pre-Breece Hall and immediately play in year 1.
And even tactically, we know teams are pointing in that direction. The Dallas Cowboys, I mean, is this, tell me if I'm reading this completely wrong from what you're seeing, but their draft approach was to take Jonathan Brooks if he got to them at the right price, or to find their starter deep in day 3. And because a couple of teams made picks they weren't anticipating, they were blocked from finding their starter in day 3, which was their plan. I mean, you have teams that are looking at it exactly that way.
I think that's a really good read on what they did. Either that, or they got guys available to them in like round 5 and round 6 that they didn't think would be available at that point, and they made this decision to trade off at running back and then end up bringing back Ezekiel Elliott. But I think that's a really good read on what they were probably planning as well. And so you would, when I make that case on Vidal, I would hope that he's playing. He seems like he's in their plans early. Now, when they get asked about him, Greg Roman continues to praise him effusively. They're talking very positively about him. Harbaugh's kind of that old school guy. I don't think it's like, I'm not out on Vidal at all, but I do think it is mildly concerning that he's starting behind so many other players and they're making him earn it in a way that's like, it'd be great if he was just working ahead of those guys. If Gus Edwards isn't in practice and they were immediately throwing him out there with J.K. Dobbins, with the, mixing in with the ones, which he's not doing. On the separate part of this conversation, Sean, is J.K. Dobbins, who's been a huge, you've been a huge fan of his for years. You've talked about, but also coming off an Achilles tear, and something that is very difficult to come off for running backs. You and I pre-show were just talking about Deontay Foreman a little bit. And for anyone who's wondering why we're talking about Deontay Foreman, let's just say it wasn't the most favorable thing. I'm pretty out on Deontay Foreman. Maybe we'll get to him on this show, but people are still drafting Deontay Foreman, and I really don't understand why. Don't think he's draftable. But he's the success story of guys who've come back from Achilles tears. Many other people have tried to return quickly and not had bursts, not been successful. One of the things I've started to draft some J.K. Dobbins because it's like he's going at the very end, and it looks like this guy's going to be the week 1 starter basically and play quite a bit. The other side of that equation is like, Cam Akers tore his Achilles that year and came back for the playoffs, and everyone was like, man, it's a miracle. He's back really quick from an Achilles tear. Modern medicine. He wasn't explosive at all when he played in that postseason. And then the next year, he also wasn't good for most of the year. It wasn't until the back end of that next year that he had a nice run, which is what tricked everybody last offseason again. And then, we haven't really seen he had that slight run at the end of 2022. But that, other than that, hasn't been very good since the Achilles tear either. Dobbins is still so close to that Achilles tear that it's a little tricky, right? To imagine what he would actually look like from a upside scenario. Can he be really efficient as a runner, or is it all just volume? Gus Edwards' peripherals really cratered last year. I think you got to be concerned about him and trying to play this backfield through the later guys. I've been drafting a lot of Vidal, and I've been drafting more Dobbins since this report and trying to get away from Vidal. How are you responding to this? I'm at least a little bit concerned, I should say, about Vidal, or I guess I did say, just having that thesis that maybe he could step right into a big role. He's now got to work for it. I don't think can't do it, but it's tricky. But how are you responding to both him and Dobbins, two guys I know you like?
Yeah, for Vital, I don't think that it's a huge issue at his price, because partly what you're concerned about with him, if you like him and you're hoping to continue to draft him at a spot where he could be league winning, is that he might impress enough right away that he would jump into, and again, depending on your format, but that 9, 10, 11 range. And you're saying, well, 13, 12 isn't that far behind that. But there are some very different types of things at those prices. If he looks good, the price is going to move in concert with that. Now, if you have huge shares of him like you and I do, partly, you could just kind of live on the shares you've already drafted. But when we're talking about someone like
them.
Right. When you're talking about a J.K. Dobbins, it's so interesting, I think, because of some of the contrasts. So he's just historically, and even when we saw him come back from previously severe injuries, and you think about him, and I mentioned this morning on the Best Ball Banana Stand, so there are some fun things there if anybody wants to check that out. But I mean, we've seen him limp down the field for 50-yard gains.
That's right.
And so when you're telling me you're going to get a massively compromised version of J.K. Dobbins, then my question is, like, who is he competing with, and what are the prices, and what are some of these things that would be similar to? Because a massively compromised version of J.K. Dobbins is basically what Gus Edwards already is. It's basically what Ezekiel Elliott already is. He's much less expensive than those players. And we certainly don't have a crystal ball. We expect the Dallas Cowboys offense to be much more dynamic than the Los Angeles Chargers offense. If you think about it purely from a rushing perspective, there certainly are scenarios in which a Jim Harbaugh offense and what we saw, with Tony Pollard last year in Dallas, who is a much better version of what they're going to try and roll out this year. The offense last year already struggled to create running back value, even with all of the points that they were scoring. I guess for me, as soon as you know that J.K. Dobbins is more or less the guy, because I have about 18% of Dobbins, even with all the Vidal exposure, and I have 0% of Edwards. And I'm not saying that that's going to definitively be right, but I think the prices pushed you in that direction. My understanding, which I was always uncertain about, in part because, as you mentioned, there isn't good information, but my understanding was that there was at least reason to be concerned that Edwards was not healthy. And so if you have a player who is no longer an NFL caliber starter who's not healthy, then I think it's a tricky price that he has, even if you think that the other people in that backfield are not good, which maybe that's already the information we're getting on Vidal, and we know that Dobbins has the injury issues. But at some point, Dobbins becomes the clear pick out of those three guys, in part because the other two are also not interesting, or not say not interesting, but have really severe problems to getting to the workload. And you expect that offense to create volume. And I guess I would say, I also think it will be a moderately efficient rushing offense. And so if you have those two things, unless you start to look at people like a Jarrett Patterson, which I mean, probably we should be keeping an eye on at this point, then
Isaiah Spiller, whoever it is.
Yeah, I mean, and Spiller has been awful, but he's another guy who did actually have some interesting collegiate numbers. And so if you get a surprising breakout from a healthy player who was a good college player and just had been covered up to this point for whatever reason, I mean, the Chargers have been a bad rushing offense under multiple coordinators going back, throughout Spiller's tenure. There's a tiny chance that he has just been put in horrible situations. Now, most likely by a long way. It's just that he's not an NFL caliber player. The one guy who seems to be in good shape and would be a viable talent, even well below 100%. I mean, it does seem to me to be J.K. Dobbins. I don't want to go into a season with a huge, and people are going to say, well, you already have a huge share, but at the price, it's a different story. I don't want my season to live and die on J.K. Dobbins and have that heartbreak again after last year. But I mean, Ben, it's getting harder and harder to stay away from him. He seems like such a clear play.
I mean, especially like the way that I've been thinking about it the last few days is people are still being, sometimes people are slow to react to this type of news and where it's going to land the guy long term. And I think people, especially in a case like this, when the guy's coming back from a big injury rehab, I think people are slow to respond. And I mean, he's barely moving up, it seems like. And if you're just willing to reach like 6 or 8 picks ahead of ADP, you're going to get him. And it's like, there's a possibility he's the week 1 starter again. Like, that's the kind of thing that as we approach the end of August, will push him up multiple rounds. He's not going to just sit in the whatever it is at this point, 17th round or 16th round until week 1. And it's like, oh yeah, nobody was drafting the week 1 starter, a running back on a team. Like that's just not going to happen
team.
On a Harbaugh team.
We're talking about round 9. Tony Pollard might be the backup on a bad team. Trey Benson might be like the 3rd or 4th running back on what we think is a good team.
Those are two
wicked
birds.
I mean, I guess Trey Benson here is in round 10. Devin Singletary, right, may not separate on a questionable team. So just to kind of emphasize like how much room his price has to run.
Yeah. And it very well might. So my immediate thought was like, well, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to be right or not, and maybe I'm going to regret all this, but I might as well get a lot now so I don't have to draft him later and feel like I've completely missed out on having any exposure to Dobbins when he's a 13th round pick, which it's not a guarantee that he will be. But with Vidal starting so deep in the pecking order and Edwards not healthy and not looking good last year, I think that's where we're headed. I think we're headed towards Edwards' price starting to slide a little bit and Dobbins probably starting to elevate. The other part of this team, Sean, that has been interesting so far has been a wide receiver. We were talking a little bit about Quentin Johnston early in the offseason. He put up huge numbers on Jim Harbaugh's Michigan Wolverines in the college football playoff 2 years ago. Thought maybe that would get him the snaps, the routes, the opportunity for a breakout. I've talked about taking a guy like him in like the eliminator format in the later rounds where you're like, okay, well, he's definitely going to have routes. This was the idea. He's definitely going to have routes. But if he also breaks out, the thesis is like, then you're going to get some big weeks, but at least he has some floor for this eliminator. He's got a role. It sounds like he doesn't have a role, Sean, because as camp opened, he's not playing in 3 receiver sets. He's got to earn his way. DJ Chark is clearly in 3 receiver sets. I've seen some people scoff at this in multiple places in the fantasy community. DJ Chark was bad for Carolina last year. There's not really any way around it. The whole Carolina passing game was very ill-conceived. People weren't getting open. 12.8% targets per out run, didn't earn volume. Very high ADOT, though, in a bad, non-functional passing game. I think you could tell yourself a story that there's other elements that kind of held DJ Chark back. If you look at him over a multiple-year trend, he's maintained really high ADOTs. He's a vertical threat. The targets per out run has fallen multiple percentage points 3 years in a row. Go back to 2019, 2020. He was a 19-ish% targets per out run guy. It fell to 17-ish% in 2021, 15 in 2022, 12.8 last year. I note that because the yards per out run has also fallen, and people love to point to that and say that he's bad, and he's done now. But we always talk about yards per out run is the target earning, targets per out run plus the yards per target. This is a deep threat in an NFL that's taking away this exact type of player and making it difficult for him to earn a lot of volume. But once the ball is thrown at DJ Chark, his yards per targets have been consistently efficient, actually. And if you do the depth-adjusted racer stuff that I like to do, even at his high ADOT, his yards per target have been positive. Even last year, he looks like a guy who was a reasonably efficient after the target player who didn't earn much volume, which is the issue. You got to get open. But now he has Justin Herbert, and he has an offense that's based on running the ball and probably some play action that's going to give him room to run these kind of deep intermediate routes. That's going to give Justin Herbert a little bit of some of these longer dropbacks, some of those types of things. I actually kind of like the fit for DJ Chark in this type of scheme. We have some question marks about Ladd McConkey. We have some question marks about Josh Palmer, who I do want to note, had the best year of his career last year. And I'm a little bit in on both of those guys as well. But Chark's a guy that I've also been snapping up in the late rounds, and I think should be a riser and is a riser right now. I saw some data that showed that he has risen a little bit because I think he's a nice fit for this offense, and some of the run-based and then play action stuff should allow him to see a little bit of a rebound, I think, in those targets per out run numbers I was just mentioning, where it's a better fit for his specific type of downfield route running. And if he can be efficient after that, if he can catch the ball on the other side of the Justin Herbert pass, there's, I think, some best ball spike week potential in the late rounds. Am I crazy? Am I sipping too much DJ Chark juice? I know you're a fan, or have been in the past.
I do like DJ Chark, and as you mentioned, I mean, it's always interesting to think about the stats that people want to emphasize on a particular player at a particular time, because you do, and I had some trouble articulating particular there, but there are still some Adam Thielen fans out there. He did obviously generate a lot more target volume, but when we think about just how bad Chark was, I mean, he averaged more yards per target last year than Thielen in a poor offense. Again, a lot of that is going to be down to the target depth, but the target depth is interesting. Then I tried to get every single one of my dynasty co-managers to draft DJ Chark in the rookie/veteran portion of the rookie draft this year in round 7. No one was interested.
I was probably among them,
because one of the things you're hoping there is that even though you're drafting guys who are not going to make NFL teams, there's always that tiny chance that even in round 7, you'll draft someone where their value actually spikes to the point where not only would they be rosterable, but they'd be tradable. And DJ Chark is not going to move to the point where he's tradable. So you can understand that. I guess for me, one of the things that happens here is I do think it hurts Josh Palmer, because you put another viable, vertical-ish player out there.
Mm-hmm. And Quinn Johnson's off my board. The thesis with him was he has a big hill to climb, but he's going to play, and it's going to allow him to try to climb it. If they're not bought it. The new coaching staff's not bought in on this guy. He's not even running with the ones right now. You can't draft him. I don't care if he's.
Well, you could still have a good camp.
Are you taking him in round 14 right now?
No, I think you have to wait. You have to wait.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
But one of the things that they did say was that last year the team used him incorrectly. You got to get the ball in his hands and let him run with it. That was one of the reasons for the pro Johnston thesis, is that for, not a little jitterbug type of guy, he's very good with the ball in his hands. You got to get the ball in his hands. Well, that would take a little bit of the shine off of Ladd McConkey, who's also a niche-ish type of receiver where, I mean, I don't mean this in as derogatory a way as it sounds, but there is a little bit of make volume element to the McConkey thesis. And he probably has a little bit less to worry about if you're not going to have Johnston on the field also getting manufactured touches. Now, they would be different types, and McConkey's would still be deeper and still be based more on route running compared to what potentially they might have asked Johnston to do. It doesn't look like that's going to be a big thing, but I still, I guess, would caution the idea that the 3 receiver set and the first team reps right now are indicative of what in-game tactics would be for sure once the season starts. And so one of the problems, I think, if you're drafting these Chargers receivers is simply that Chark siphons enough to make, I mean, they're all very unpalatable. This is not like the running back version of this. I haven't quite understood the prices on the Chargers receivers this offseason. McConkey and Palmer look to me to be overvalued. I don't think Chark running with the ones does anything other than maybe make it a little bit more dangerous for Palmer, because this could be the type of passing offense where there just simply isn't very much value, and you're not getting shootouts. You're not getting the types of spike weeks that would help in best ball. I guess I struggle to, and maybe I'm just completely wrong. We could come out and have Palmer be a guy who takes the next step and is interesting. But you think about redraft, and would you feel comfortable putting these guys on a team and starting them? I mean, probably not early in the season. And then even as it evolves, I mean, you need to get a really high end outcome for the Chargers passing offense to get to where you start putting Joshua Palmer into your starting lineup in redraft. So I guess for me, one of the things I wonder about here now, maybe the running game is so bad that even with the mentality of this coaching staff, that they end up more pass heavy than we think. That would be the other side of the
That's what I
coin
was
there.
gonna. When I
But
did my projection, Sean, I wound up a little bit more bullish on the pass volume, also because I think the assumptions that are being made on the mentality of the coaching staff are very reasonable. Harbaugh ran even the Michigan offense this way last year, but neither of them's ever had a quarterback like Justin Herbert. They when they were together in San Francisco had a little bit of Alex Smith together, but he's still a little bit of a different type of quarterback and a mobile one. And then it was 2.5 years of Colin Kaepernick.
so that you don't
Uh,
think they would have used a first round or a top 10 pick on JJ McCarthy?
they might have been thinking about it, honestly. Greg Roman, the rest of his background is with Tyrod Taylor in Buffalo, and then obviously young Lamar Jackson in Baltimore. Very run heavy offenses, but all featured mobile quarterbacks as well. Herbert doesn't really add that element, and obviously is a big stand back there, big armed passer. I'm projecting them to be like a negative pass rate over expected team, which the Chargers have not been the past couple of years. They were a little bit more neutral last year. They were solidly positive in 2021 and 2022, but I'm not projecting them to be a massively negative pass rate over expected team. And if you get them reasonably close to league average in expected pass rate, I think you start to talk about some scenarios where the receivers could be decent. That would be the one thing I would question with what you were saying about the whole passing game is what if the volume is okay? Not great, but okay. I think the market is making an assumption that the volume is going to be pretty bad.
That's interesting. And I think one of the reasons why the projection exercise is valuable, even if you question some of the other elements of doing projections.
And I should be clear, doing it that way, I still only got McConkey like he's behind JSN in my projections, like right where he goes in ADP, right? And I got Josh Palmer right behind Jerry Jeudy and right ahead of Tyler Lockett, which is about where he goes in Underdog. He goes ahead of Jerry Jeudy, but we both really like Jerry Jeudy at cost. It's not like suddenly these guys look like screaming values when I'm projecting some more pass volume. So maybe my point about the market is actually backwards, that the market is actually playing it this way, the way that I just described. And there's actually risk of what you're describing, that it could be even run heavier. And then there really is no value. I mean, there's multiple ways to look at it, I think.
One of the assumptions, to my mind, about how the community is thinking through this team is that it's going to be low volume, but Justin Herbert is a star. And I think that we have to consider that for a couple of years now with different coordinators, he's been merely a competent NFL starter, which is still a very high threshold to meet. You know, numerous teams are knocked down every season because they don't have that. But if he's not a star, and if the Chargers are in the type of build where the team identity is dramatically more important to them than winning games in 2024. And maybe this isn't that point at all. Maybe it's completely different. But you think about Malik Neighbors being available and them taking a lineman. I think it's going to be smash mouth football. I think it's going to be effective. I mean, one of the ways in which I maybe diverge from some fantasy analysts is I don't think we're just football analysts. I don't think that it has to be something that fails simply because there are some pretty high thresholds to meet to be a successful run-oriented team and offense. But I guess I think that the level of competency on the coaching staff and with the QB creates an environment where you're not going to chase from a point perspective in the way that you might think the Chargers with their current talent level would have to do if they had a different coaching staff and a different coach. I guess what I'm saying is I don't expect a lot of garbage time shootouts. I don't expect a lot of shootouts in general. I don't think that we're going to see the Chargers get down a couple touchdowns and say to themselves, the way to make the playoffs this season is to win this game in the second half throwing. I think they're going to show people that they can out-tough them in 2024, even if it means losing games, and that when you come back in 2025, they are going to be one of the most physically dominant teams in football. And then establishing that is more important than winning a game or two here and there this season. Now, that's a little bit of an oversimplification of what will actually happen. I mean, they're going to spend, thousands of hours setting up the specific game tactics, obviously the overall strategy for the team in the season. They're going to have injuries. They're going to have guys who emerge. All of those things will come into play when they're faced with different choices about calling a pass play or calling a run play in the third quarter, down 10, what have you. So I don't want to make it sound like I think that there's one, very simplistic element that will dictate everything they do. But I guess I am skeptical about the passing volume because I think they're just going to be such a competent team without being a good team. And if you put those two things together, you could really thread this needle to where there's just not that much fantasy value for anybody on the team. And, I think it's a very important and interesting conversation, both as it relates to the Chargers and as it relates to other teams that we may not get to. But it's very possible that in 3 months, nothing about the Chargers was fantasy relevant.
Yeah. And I guess, that's sort of how I'm playing it. I'm not taking a lot of Ladd. I'm not taking a lot of Palmer. I'm mixing them in because I think I'm a little bit more bullish than you on some of the ways that they could fit in the passing game. I'm taking a lot of Idell and not taking Gus, who's the most expensive running back. It's sort of like you get the cheaper pieces if what you're describing is the concern. Now I'm taking Dobbins. Now I'm taking some Chark if I think his volume's going to be there. I don't want to completely not draft an offense entirely when there's this much uncertainty because there is uncertainty here. We know a lot about Harbaugh and Roman. I think you make a great point about the NFL draft decision and how, I had not been probably weighing that enough more recently in my thinking. But at the time, it very much was like, yeah, we're making a point here. We're not drafting a quarterback. We're not drafting JJ McCarthy. We're not drafting Malik Neighbors, who's sitting there. We're drafting an offensive lineman who, people were not projecting necessarily. They were projecting that as a need for the Chargers, but most people had Alt going to, the Titans a little bit later because they had the Chargers taking a receiver because it was such a glaring need. And they're like, we'll figure out receiver later. We don't care about that position. We care about offensive line, which is telling you something. So yeah.
Then the flip side is that if you make some of those Chargers investments, you will get to face the two-headed monster of Drake May and Jacoby Brissett in week 17. So like 45-42, is that
So we're heading into the Patriots discussion, which is it ties into the Chargers because they are week 17 correlated. I haven't taken a lot of either side. That was something in my projection, Sean, that I felt like I came out a little concerned. I think there's reason to be excited about Drake May's ceiling, but one of the things I've heard mentioned as a positive with the Patriots wide receivers, we talked about this a little bit before the show, is that there's a lot of them and you can stack them all and there's a lot of different ways to stack them. And so that makes May appealing. I did the projection was like, this is a team projected for the fewest points in football. They have two rookies who have somewhat questionable profiles in Jalen Polk and Javon Baker. They have Demario Douglas, who's probably going to earn some volume out of the slot. And they still brought back Kendrick Bourne on a pretty meaningful contract and gave KJ Osborne a free agent contract that was less meaningful, but he's there too. There's this possibility that 5 different guys are playing at wide receiver at different times throughout the season. And you have Hunter Henry, who's probably factoring in some. I saw an earlier report. I mentioned to you that Javon Baker is going to struggle to crack the first team. You mentioned to me that Javon Baker's been getting all of this buzz in camp, and it took me a minute. I went and looked it up, and I was finding all that, and I hadn't seen that prior. It's a fascinating conversation with the Patriots, but if you're not really into playing the Chargers, avoiding the Patriots to me feels fine. That's there's a lot of names to get right. Who's going to emerge from that? Drake May has to be a really big hit, and this passing game has to be really exciting and bring along multiple players. And then you're like, okay, well, I got one of the 3 good players in this passing game. But you're smiling as I say that, because I don't know if either of you or I expect there to be 3 good receivers in this passing game.
No.
All right. So that's
it's interesting, right? Because this is a team where you and I talked about it a lot, that it looked like they probably took the better prospect second. And yet there's a lot of buzz around Jalen Polk as well. And that's one of the reasons why Baker could be buried. I know Baker has had a lot of trouble with drops. That was one of the big flaws in his profile. And then he had trouble with drops during the offseason work with the Patriots. So the range of outcomes for this team is just so massively wide in terms of who plays at all. But then it gets concentrated the other direction in that the overall volume for the team will probably be very low. And so that doesn't mean that a winner couldn't emerge when you have absolutely no clarity on what the roles will be or how that will really manifest in terms of how the offense will be designed to get individual players volume. You could have Polk end up as the guy. But one of the things that, you've always pointed out, and I was mind blown by when I went through and really dug into the details. I mean, Polk was someone who, number one, he was the 3rd best receiver for the Washington Huskies in 2022. And then in 2023, he put up a couple of goose eggs at important moments. That in no way means that he couldn't be a star. He still definitely could. And yet those are pretty big problems to wave away with highlights in training camp, especially when you're almost certainly going to get the mix of a veteran QB who, even though, one of the problems I think for Drake May is simply that Jacoby Brissett, when he has gotten a chance to play recently, has played very, very well. The flip side of it is that once you get May, that's a difficult profile from a fantasy perspective, specifically for the receivers, where yes, you get vertical passing, but you also potentially get more rushing, which would cut directly and perhaps dramatically against the receivers. But you also have a lot of concerns about accuracy and being able to execute some of these types of throws. So essentially what you're getting is a rich man's Will Levis. If you don't have stars, especially, but even if you had stars, Ben, that is problematic for, again, a Patriots team where, similar to the Chargers situation, it's probably not a roster that's pointed at 2024. And we're going to be looking at the team making decisions for the long-term health of the organization, which in this case is going to mean guys like May and Polk. And how do we put them out there in a way that doesn't damage them for the future, as you would expect there to be struggles and failures this year?
Yeah. And again, you can project teams to beat market expectation, but if you go through and look at the look ahead lines and some of those things, like, this is the team that is expected to score the fewest points in the NFL this year, based on Vegas, based on the market, what is put out there. If you're really high on Drake May, if you're really high on these receivers and all those things, you could probably go take some overs, on some of their futures lines. It's a tricky one for sure. You get a defensive head coach, you get Alex Van Pelt taking over as offensive coordinator. He's been with the Browns the last few years. Hasn't been a bad coordinator, but probably got let go because they wanted to move towards more passing there, and probably going to be a little bit more of a run-based team. My perception of them when I did the projection is like, they're going to be bad and they're going to run. They're going to be this, run-based, defensive-minded, set a new culture type team that throws off of that but doesn't throw in massive ways. Maybe I'll be proven wrong there, but I am I didn't come out of the projection feeling like their market expectations of a really low touchdown total are very hard to see. It's sort of the way that um, it looks. May, as you mentioned, will scramble. He also took sacks at a decent rate. They don't have a perfect offensive line. He's willing to push the ball down the field, but also will throw some picks. Jacoby Brissett, among the things that he does well is he's had a really low INT rate the last few years. It feels I mean, I don't want to do the exact same thing as Brissett and Howell last year. And obviously we were Team Howell last year at that situation. And Howell was very good for most of the year, but did end up getting benched for Brissett late. It feels a little bit like that, except for the team is telling you that they don't know if May is ready. And they've been saying that since they drafted him, that he's a young quarterback, needs some seasoning, although they are giving him some first team reps. So it's an interesting thing. It'll be interesting to see how they play. I do think they're going to play a slower and less exciting brand of football than the way that they're often drafted. Their ADPs are late, but people are often looking to them for late stacks.